The first one is the theory of uses and gratification. Now, in Chapter 10 of the Sage Handbook, the author goes into great detail explaining this theory and argues that it is one of the most basic and widely used approaches to studying media entertainment. Now, it was developed in the 1940s as an approach to understanding how and why people seek out specific media to satisfy their needs. They discovered that motivated behavior and involvement were absolutely critical. In fact, Katz, an expert in the field of communication, argues that even powerful media cannot usually influence people who have no use for that media or message. For example, Fox News networks. I'm never going to use any of that because I believe that they're too biased, and all of their messages that they target at me go right over my head. And another example for internet usage found by Kay reported 6 motives for using the internet and discovered that they are entertainment, social interaction, passing time, escape, information, and website preferences.
Okay, the next theory that I'm going to be talking about is the theory of cognitive dissonance. Now, this is a favorite of mine because it's simply so interesting. It was developed by a man by the name of Leon Festinger, and his original hypothesis was that if a certain individual felt psychologically uncomfortable, then he or she would be motivated to reduce the feeling of discomfort in order to maintain an equilibrium, a mental balance, if you will. And I guess the best example that I can provide would be if you're walking down the street and you see a homeless man begging for change. No one's particularly enthusiastic about that situation. No one wants to be in that situation. So in order to reduce cognitive dissonance, you could do 2 things. You could A, completely go a different direction, which would, eliminate the situation altogether. Or B, you could, pretend to talk on your cell phone as you walk past him. Either one of those would be a good example of reducing cognitive dissonance or returning to a mental equilibrium, because that situation brings people out of the equilibrium. But by doing either of those 2 things, you can revert back to a mental balance, which is essentially what the cognitive dissonance theory is all about.
The next theory is pretty interesting. It's called selective exposure, and it basically means that individuals tend to seek out information that follow their own ideals while avoiding those that contradict it. For me, when it comes to news, I tend to avoid Fox News because they're just a little biased and overtly, emotional when it comes to presenting news. I don't even have to go into Bill O'Reilly and his antics, but that's a good example of selective exposure. I choose not to watch that, yet I choose to watch networks like CNN or MSNBC or any other news network. But this article, Polarization and Partisan Selective Exposure, asks the question, do partisan media, such as the shows hosted on Limbaugh or Franken, lead people to develop more polarized audiences, or do these programs merely attract people who are polarized audiences? So it's asking whether or not it changes people's views, or it just simply attracts people who already share the views of those who host the show. Copywriter, I know I'm going to be using these theories quite a bit. More so cognitive dissonance and selective exposure than uses and gratification. But indeed, I will be using all these theories at one point or another. But for cognitive dissonance, let's say my client is an eyeglass place, and let's say they want me to run a magazine ad or something like that. Well, instead of, the copy being nice and crisp, maybe it's a little fuzzy. Maybe it makes your eyes hurt a little bit and gives you a sense of cognitive dissonance that you want to avoid, and the only way you can avoid that is by buying some sunglasses or eyeglasses. And same thing, with the motion sickness company. Maybe I'll have a little bit of motion in there to make you a little seasick, to make you want to buy those pills. So that's one way. As for selective exposure, that's pretty self-explanatory. If I'm writing an ad for someone who mountain bikes, I'm not going to put an ad in a Hello Kitty Island Adventure magazine. I'm probably going to put it in Mountain Biking Weekly or something like that. So that's how I would use those 2 theories. So in Chapter 11 of the Sage Handbook, the author talks about the entertainment theory. And this theory pretty much states that entertainment, or just general excitement, is incredibly important to our daily lives, whether it be movies, music, TV, it could be anything. In fact, you got the Breaking Bad poster right up there, that's a sign of entertainment. You got the Big Lebowski poster right here, that's entertainment. You got books, that's entertainment. Drinking games, that's entertainment. Entertainment is just an integral part of human life. And according to the Entertainment Software Association, from 2003 to 2006, the entertainment industry grew an amazing 17%, whereas in the same amount of time, the U.S. economy only grew 4%. So that goes to show how important entertainment is to society and us as a species. And that's pretty much what this whole chapter talks about. So this next theory is called the transportation theory, and it's another one of my favorites. Some people also call it the narrative transportation theory because, well, narratives are involved. However, when you think of transportation, you usually think of, trains or cars or boats or something like that. This does not have anything to do with it. In fact, it is a purely metaphorical transportation. And this reading essentially states that when people lose themselves in a story, their attitudes, beliefs, anything change to reflect the story that they're watching. So, for example, I was watching, let's say, Lord of the Rings, and even though I know the Uruk-hai or the goblins are completely, made up, I still had a passion, a hatred, a passion for them, and that would be a pretty good example of how I transported into the world of the Lord of the Rings. In this next article written by Emily Moyer-Gusset, the author brings up a very valid point. She believes that the way we have been going about promoting pro-social issues as well as health messages have been all wrong. She believes that an entertainment education-based message will be far more effective, and she uses multiple theories including the transportation theory and entertainment theory to help prove her claims. And she mentions how the involvement of characters, who is telling the story and who identifies with the characters and who the characters are and whether or not the people identifying them are wishful identifications or identifications because of visible similarities. She mentions how all of these elements are very important, and when put together properly, a pro-social message or a health-related message can be far more effective than the way we have been doing things the past 10 years. So this next article combines two things. It combines the elaboration likelihood model and the entertainment education theory. And in this article, they try to get a better understanding of why something like this would work more so than previous attempts of pure persuasion. And they utilize a couple theories. The transportation theory is one of them. The entertainment theory is another one. And they basically examine how and why an entertainment education commercial for a pro-social or medical issue would be more effective. And they found out that it mainly has to do with the story. And they found there are two things that will affect the interest of an individual watching the story. And they are, one, the individual's intrinsic interest in the type of story, whether it's romantic or comedy or drama, as well as the quality of the narrative. And they also look at engagement versus absorption into the stories, as well as identification with the characters. So the four theories that I just talked about, entertainment theory and the transportation theory, are the two that are going to play the most important role in my career as a copywriter. Now, I am going to write to entertain. I'm not going to write to bore people. I'm not going to write those Sarah McLachlan ads that make people want to turn them off. I want people to enjoy themselves. I want people to enjoy ads and buy stuff because of them. I also want to use the transportation theory to make people believe that they're in a world where they need this product, where they need those motion sickness pills, where they need those sunglasses that make their eyes, feel better. So those are the two theories that I would use the most. So in chapter 12 of the Sage Handbook, the author talks about priming and the priming theory and refers to it as the effect of some preceding stimulus or event on how we react, broadly defined to the subsequent event or person. Now, there are three characteristics with this theory, the first of which is that a prime will dissipate with time. Secondly,
a stronger prime will generally have stronger effects on a person's judgments or opinions or actions. And thirdly, a prime will be more effective when the situation is ambiguous. Now, later on, the theory or the chapter talks about violence and priming and aggression and priming, and how violence on TV will result in violence in real life. But then they talk about some limitations, one of which was brought up in the responsibility, what is your policy example that was shown in the beginning. And they couldn't figure out if it was because a person was genuinely nice that he replicated an act of kindness, or if it was because he saw an act of kindness and decided to replicate it. So that's one of the limitations that they discussed in this chapter. Chapter 13 talks about a very complex theory, and it's called the limited capacity model of motivated mediated message processing. And it basically talks about how we as a human species process information. Now, there are 5 basic assumptions. The first one is that humans are assumed to be limited capacity information processors. The second one is that humans have 2 evolutionary motivational systems. And the third one is that media are conceptualized as continuous and continuously varying streams of sensory information. The fourth one is that human activity is ongoing. And the fifth one is that communication is the ongoing, dynamic, continuous interaction between a message or a medium and a message recipient or user. It's very complex stuff. But there are 4 basic steps in this processing information, and it's 1, information processing, 2, encoding, 3, storage, and 4, retrieval. Chapter 14 of the Sage Handbook talks about emotion. And this is pretty important because emotion is seen everywhere in the mass communication field. In every ad and every commercial you see, there's some form of emotional appeal. And although we cannot agree on a single definition of emotion, we can agree on 5 basic components. And these basic components are as follows. 1, cognitive appraisal or evaluation of a situation. 2, the psychological component of arousal. 3, a subjective feeling state. 4, a motivational component, including behavior intentions. And 5, motor expressions. Now, it's very difficult to quantify emotions. It may be easy to get someone to respond, to how they feel, but because they are self-reported, they may not be accurate, which is why we have galvanic skin responses and eye tracking software. And when we measure emotion in message processing or in persuasion or aggression or any other form of anything, it's very difficult to quantify, and we try to limit these limitations. Chapter 15 of the Sage Handbook talks about mediated relationships and media effects, but more specifically it goes into great detail about parasocial relationships and identification. Now, identification is much older than parasocial relationships, and although it is older, it is far less developed because this parasocial relationships is something that has been of great interest to researchers as of the past decade. But these 2 concepts basically describe ways in which audience members connect emotionally to and cognitively to these images of people and the auditory things that they hear on television and radio and magazines and stuff like that. And one thing I found interesting in this chapter is a quote, and it says, "One can hardly imagine any television text having any effect whatever without that identification," meaning, a TV text on a TV is not the same as a story being told, and I find that pretty interesting. The 4 theories that I just talked about, the one that stands out the most is the theory of emotion. Now, as a copywriter, as someone who's trying to influence someone to buy something, there's something more powerful than emotional appeal. And the one example that I can bring up that will stick with me for the rest of my life, that actually was told to me by my instructor at my internship at the Price Group, was take a look at Apple and take a look at Microsoft. And you'll see Mac or Apple, they appeal to people on an emotional level. Microsoft appeals to people on a business level. And look where they're at right now. I mean, Apple is just blowing the competition away, and Microsoft is struggling, just to maintain their market share.